A nuclear meltdown does not always start with a bomb-sized bang. Sometimes it starts with a bucket of uranium stirred by hand, a glowing powder handed out as jewelry, or firefighters aiming garden hoses at a burning reactor core. One of these accidents emptied a city of 50,000 people in 36 hours, and none of them ever moved back. The reactor Britain set on fire. If you think nuclear disasters are a Cold War specialty of the Soviets or the Americans, this one belongs to Britain. In October 1957, at Windscale in Cumbria, on England's northwest coast, workers ran a military reactor built to produce plutonium for atomic weapons, and nobody outside a small circle of scientists had rehearsed for what came next.
Because the reactor's core was packed with graphite blocks stacked like an oversized set of library shelves to soak up heat, and because operators pushed the cooling process too far to release trapped energy, a fire ignited deep in the core where nobody could see it. If you stood at the control panel that week, you would have watched temperature gauges climb with no clear explanation, hours before anyone said the word fire out loud. But the real danger was still ahead. Standard water cooling could have triggered a hydrogen explosion, so engineers pointed fire hoses into a reactor never designed to take water at all, betting against physics. The gamble worked, and the fire went out with the core still sealed.
For decades, British officials described it in public reports simply as a fire, keeping the word nuclear out of the record, because admitting it meant admitting the country's own bomb program had caught fire too. The meltdown Jimmy Carter helped clean. In December 1952, at the Chalk River Laboratories in Ontario, Canada, operators were running experiments on one of the most advanced research reactors on the planet, the NRX.
A technician misread a set of valves and left several control rods withdrawn by mistake, so reactor power surged past safe limits before anyone could react, and part of the core melted inside its containment vessel. If you stood in the control room that morning, you would have felt the floor shake as hydrogen gas ignited beneath the reactor lid and blew it toward the ceiling. The cleanup that followed turned into something almost nobody could have predicted. The United States Navy sent a young submarine officer named Jimmy Carter, decades before he became president, to help lead teams into the radioactive building for exposures timed down to the second. Crews rehearsed each job on a full-scale replica of the reactor floor above ground, then ran in, completed it, and ran back out before their dose limit expired. Over months, workers pumped more than 4 million liters of contaminated water out of the basement, salvaging a machine other countries had already written off.
Chalk River reopened. Decades later, its own emergency responder would sit in the Oval Office, having once measured his life inside a nuclear building by the second. America's only deadly reactor explosion. In January 1961, at the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho, 3 Army technicians worked the night shift on a small experimental reactor called SL-1, built to test power supply for remote military outposts. A single central control rod had to be pulled out by hand to restart the reactor after maintenance, and because it was yanked upward far faster than procedure allowed, the reactor jumped instantly from shutdown to a runaway chain reaction. If you stood inside that room, you would have had less than a second between a routine restart and a steam explosion powerful enough to lift the entire reactor vessel off the floor. What investigators found next made the accident even stranger.
All 3 men were dead before help arrived, one of them pinned to the ceiling by a piece of the reactor's own structure, torn loose in the blast. For years, the leading theory pointed to sabotage or a broken marriage. Later analysis leaned toward a simpler explanation. The rod had likely stuck from corrosion, and freeing it took a violent jerk that overshot every safety margin at once. It remains the only reactor accident in American history to kill anyone on the spot, a fact fewer people know than the names Chernobyl or Fukushima. The Soviet disaster hidden for decades. In September 1957, at the Mayak plutonium plant near the closed city of Kishtim in the Ural Mountains, engineers had spent years storing liquid nuclear waste in underground steel tanks, cooled by systems never built to run that long. One tank's cooling system failed without anyone noticing in time, so the waste inside slowly overheated and dried out until it turned into an unstable mixture of nitrate salts. essentially rebuilding an explosive by accident. If you stood within several miles that evening, you would have made out a column of smoke and radioactive dust punching a hole into the sky, then drifting for days across an area larger than the country of Luxembourg. Soviet authorities responded with a decision that outlasted the explosion itself. They told nobody. Villages were evacuated over the following year under vague cover stories, and maps of the region were quietly redrawn to erase entire towns from the record. The West only pieced the story together decades later, mostly from scientific papers, defector accounts, and satellite images of a landscape with villages missing from official maps. Today, those same satellites are the reason a government could no longer make a disaster like Kishtim disappear. The valve that panicked a nation. If you were near a television set in March 1979, you likely remember this one firsthand. At 3 Mile Island, on a river island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a stuck valve and confusing warning lights led operators to shut off emergency cooling water at the exact moment the core needed it most. The core sat without proper cooling for hours while operators misread their own instruments, so part of it melted down inside a containment building that held. If you stood in the control room during those hours, you would have caught sight of dozens of alarm lights blinking at once, like a switchboard with every line ringing, no single gauge explaining what was actually happening. Fear moved faster than the facts. News anchors reported a possible meltdown before officials confirmed one. The governor told pregnant women and small children to leave the area, and families packed their cars without knowing if they fled a catastrophe or a false alarm. Later studies found no clear rise in cancer rates among nearby residents, but the fear had already reshaped an entire industry. Not one new nuclear power plant broke ground in the United States for more than 3 decades afterward, a stuck valve doing more lasting damage to nuclear power in America than the meltdown itself. The explosion that emptied a city. In April 1986, at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine, engineers ran a safety test at night with several protection systems switched off, testing whether the turbines could keep power flowing during a shutdown. That test combined an unstable reactor design with a sequence of disabled safeguards, so power spiked instantly out of control, and steam explosions tore the reactor building open, throwing burning graphite onto the roof and into the night air. If you stood in the nearby city of Pripyat that night, you would have watched a strange orange glow over the plant for hours before any official word came, while children still went to school the next morning as if nothing had happened. The truth caught up within 36 hours. Authorities evacuated all 50,000 residents of Pripyat, telling them to pack only a few days of belongings, promising they would be back soon. Nobody ever moved back in. This was not a slow industrial accident. It was a city frozen mid-morning, laundry still on balcony lines, and toys still on classroom floors, sealed inside a zone the size of a small American county. Decades later, wolves and wild horses now outnumber people inside that zone, an ecosystem quietly rebuilding itself in the one place humans agreed to leave alone. The bucket mixing that went nuclear. Workers at a small fuel processing plant in Tokaimura, Japan, prepared a batch of enriched uranium fuel one afternoon in September 1999, using a process so routine that supervisors had let it drift far from the original safety manual over the years. The real procedure called for careful, incremental mixing inside specialized tanks, but workers had learned to shortcut it by pouring uranium solution into an ordinary stainless steel bucket by hand, adding more material than any safe batch should ever contain. If you stood beside that bucket, you would have seen a flash of blue light, like an old camera bulb firing. Except this flash meant a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction had just started in an open container on a factory floor. The exposure that followed could not be undone.
The 2 workers closest to the bucket absorbed doses of radiation high enough to break down their bodies at a cellular level within days, doses far beyond anything a hospital could reverse. One of them died months later, his medical team documenting a decline doctors had rarely observed so directly in a living patient. Tokaimura's inspectors had signed off on the same paperwork for years without once watching the actual work being done in that room. The glowing powder sold as jewelry.
In September 1987, 2 scavengers broke into an abandoned cancer clinic in Goiânia, Brazil, looking for scrap metal, and pulled out a small medical device neither recognized as dangerous. The device held a capsule of cesium-137 used for radiation therapy, and breaking it open, released a fine blue glowing powder that looked more like glitter than poison. so the men sold it to a junkyard owner who found it beautiful. If you stood in that junkyard that week, you would have noticed family members rubbing the glowing powder on their skin, and a man's wife wrapping bits of it as gifts for relatives, certain they had found something wonderful rather than lethal. The poisoning spread hand to hand at family dinners and visits, contaminating homes and furniture, and eventually, a small girl who ate a sandwich with glowing powder still on her fingers. Doctors only identified the danger once several people were already critically ill, after a suspicious clinic worker had the material tested, and radiation alarms across the city began going off at once. 4 people died, and entire houses were later demolished and buried as radioactive waste. By the time doctors traced the illness back to its source, the capsule had already passed hand to hand through a dozen households as a treasured find rather than a warning sign. The wave that broke 3 reactors. In March 2011, off the northeast coast of Japan, a massive undersea earthquake triggered a tsunami racing toward the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, a facility whose reactors had already shut down automatically the moment the ground started shaking. The plant's seawall stood under 6 meters, built to stop a wave well under half the size of what actually arrived, so water poured over the top and flooded the diesel generators meant to keep the cooling pumps running. If you stood on the plant's grounds that afternoon, you would have caught sight of a wall of water roughly the height of a 4-story building, swallowing buildings that engineers had genuinely believed were safe from any realistic flood. The crisis multiplied instead of easing. With cooling knocked out at 3 reactors at once, fuel began to melt within hours, hydrogen built up inside containment buildings, and explosions blew the roofs off structures meant to hold radiation in. More than 100,000 people were evacuated from the surrounding area, some for weeks, others for a decade or more, while crews worked through debris too radioactive to approach directly. Robots now do work no human safely can, mapping melted fuel that may not be fully cleared for another generation. Every accident on this list forced engineers to ask a harder question about what could go wrong next, and Fukushima is still answering it in real time. If any of these disasters changed how you think about nuclear power, hit subscribe for more every format deep dives every week.